EDGAR CAYCE. Planetary Sojourn in Mercury. Part 1. A soul's sojourn in planet Mercury will give that soul greater mental abilities and reasoning abilities or intelligence, when returning to planet Earth. The influences from the indwelling in Mercury make for the high mental efficiency and mental abilities. The purposes of an entity's sojourn in the Earth are not merely to make good in the material plane, but that the entity may prepare itself for the eternal, which is of the spiritual. Those periods of planetary sojourn during the interims between the manifestations and materiality on Earth are indicated from the astrological symbols or signs. Not that the physical body sojourned in Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, or any of the other planets of this particular solar system. But the use of the mental and the opportunities and relationships to the spiritual and physical is indicated by a soul's sojourn of the entity in the planetary environs accredited with such an influence. Thus, as we find here, these are the characteristics, as might be said, which arise as a composite of the mental or the spiritual and material aspects. In that in Mercury, brings as the mental abilities of the entity. One given, then, in the application of same, to reason from any viewpoint. Any condition must have, to the entity, a reasonableness, for same to be of worth or of use to the entity, or, for that matter, to anyone else. Things out of reason are as conditions out of season, to the entity. The influences from Mercury make for a high mental ability, one whose judgments are good. Yet oft in the experience has the entity sought the counsel of others, as others have sought the counsel of the entity, as to their relationships. In Mercury, making for those mental abilities, especially as to detail information. In self is seen the reasoning influences of Mercury. Those influences from the sojourns in Mercury we find making for the high mental abilities of the entity. What may be termed the mental acumen, and yet capable of making application of same in those directions in which there may be said to be the greater material activity. Or the abilities for the entity to use same in those or given directions that may make for an experience in the mental and in the physical activities of the entity. Also from those same influences there arises the austereness, a solemnity of every experience. Mental acumen means the ability to make good judgments and quick decisions. The influences from Mercury, we find, make for a high mental efficiency, and the ability for an analysis of conditions and relations. Yet the entity has not always given proper evaluations of circumstances or conditions. Hence here the judgments of the intuitive nature may be brought to mean a great deal more in the experience of the entity. From Mercury we find the mental expression, and an analytical nature in its relationships with the mental influences and forces dealing with the activity in such relationships. In Mercury the mental influences are abroad in different directions and or over a wide area, either for the uplifting in the activities of the mental being, or turned into those of selfish natures. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities that make for the ability of the opening of self and its channels in the body for the mental expression of the influences in and about self. Mercury makes for a high mental concept, the ability of the entity to grasp much of that which becomes hidden in those things that man in his search has made as a mystery to his very own experience. In the astrological indications, though, we find Mercury making for that inclination for a seeker, the high mental abilities, an analytical mind, one delving into the mysteries. But keep thine self, thine ideal as first and foremost in thy seeking. For he, set as thy standard, may guide thee in making for an application in thy daily experience, those influences and forces that will make the experience in the present worthwhile. In Mercury's influence we find the high sensitiveness of the entity in its mental capacities. These very sensitivenesses at times make for the feelings, as it were, of those influences about the entity that often produce timidity, fear that arises from those very influences. Yet it should be known within self that if there is the holding to the influence that must be as the ideal, all lesser influences become of none effect. For as it has been expressed and given by others, know that when self is giving of the best of self in expression, those forces from the creative energies themselves are upon thy side. Then who may be against thee? In Mercury making for the high mental abilities, especially in those fields that will attain to that of being either the entertainer, the director, in those fields of dramatic art, or in those things that give the expression of the mental forces of the individual into and unto its fellow man. This influence in Mercury will make for a high mental development. In Mercury there is a high mental influence, as well as the associations with those things that deal with the high mental abilities. So far as material as well as spiritual influences are concerned in their effect upon the associations of the entity with others. Those influences from Mercury make for the high mental and intuitive forces. In Mercury, brings for those of the mental development, with an analytical mind. The influences in Mercury show a great mental ability, and a memory that if it is kept in a developing way and manner becomes rather unusual, as to data, as to facts or figures, as to statistical developments in any field in which it may be applied. For in thy mental self, as in Mercury, makes for the high mental abilities, good judgments as of peoples. And use same, not for self but rather that thy own vision, thy own scope of judgments may be broadened by the exercising of those very forces. For how hath it been given? As the man thinketh in his heart, so is he. That is an ideal, that is a living experience for each entity. From Mercury we find a high mental ability. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities of the entity. And with those tendencies to analyze any given project, any given undertaking that may deal with the material world. Mercury makes for the high mental abilities, and the reasoning faculties. The Mercurian, the high mental ability, the seeker. In Mercury we find one making for the high mental abilities, one becoming very capable in whatever field of activity or endeavor in which the entity's mental and soul self finds material expression. In Mercury we find that seeking for high mental aspirations, high mental abilities. In Mercury is indicated the high mental activities of the entity. Do not let thy reason overshadow or be in the way of love. Mercury, a good mental mind, one that can remember or recall easily, if the entity sets itself to such. Thus it might become a wonderful student, once it had found itself and become determined in the course to pursue. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities. Mercury, or mind, becomes an influence, while the material sojourns become as the urges from the emotional. Mercury makes for the mental abilities, the abilities for direction. In the Mercurian experience the high mental abilities, and with keen judgments in many directions. In Mercury the high mental abilities of the entity, the abilities to disseminate, the abilities to give to others a way or manner of expression or of manifesting that as may be the guiding influence in thine own experience. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities of the entity, yet there are inclinations for the entity to become or to be headstrong, determined, even at times to its own undoing unless it is tempered with those reasonable influences of a spiritual nature. And as spirit is universal, then to become resentful becomes a stumbling block, and hard-headedness begets madness and wrath, rather than love and faith and hope that is the essence of growth. For hate, animosity, and the like is rather that which produces stagnation and retardments in the experience of one. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities, with a development or ability to be developed to that activity as an executive. Especially as related both to facts and figures, or activities that would be called the statistician or datistician, whether this would apply to one phase of an experience or another. Those as would become the more adept, or in which the entity might become the more adept, would be in dealing with activities of individuals, whether in a commercial sphere or in recordings for activities in physical, or in even the mental aspirations and activities would be a part of the entity's innate or natural experience for development and activity. Mercury, making for the high mental abilities, yet oft the greater influence from the Neptune sojourn, or the mystic forces overrule or supersede in giving expression of the activities of the entity. For, as may be indicated from Mercury, the high mental abilities of the entity. In Mercury we find one of high mental ability, or with that ability, no matter in what phase or field of activity, to carry itself off. Or if the occasion warrants, and there are things with which it is not acquainted, it can carry it off as if it were well versed in any of the activities apparent in the associations or contacts with the entity. Mercury is the leading influence. Hence the high mental abilities, and the inclinations for the entity to make for itself, especially during its first 10 years from the present, a career in the field of activity which would be associated with office work, or writing, or stenography, or bookkeeping, or things pertaining to things as well as conditions and relations between individuals, and these will bring for the entity the opportunities in many ways and manners. The independence of the entity arises, too, from the innate urges as from the Mercurian influence. One of high mental abilities. While it would require great expressions of activity to change its opinions, for it is inclined to be what some would call very hard-headed, or very set, these are as the natural urges. Not that they may not be changed, but these are such that it must be shown before there will be an altering of opinions, and very set opinions oft arise in all phases of the experience. Under the influence of Mercury, as we see, one then of an exceptional mental abilities, especially in the handling of business. The policies of the business, then, should ever be in that way of the sure and right, and ever should this entity be ruled or guided by one with the stable influence in their life. Though the entity may find that in self, with the better influences, there may be developed that which will bring the greater joys to self, through the spiritual forces of the entity. Mercury, the high mental abilities. And without the Mercurian reaction we might find adverse forces, as indicated in the Pisces with Jupiter, bringing in adverse influence in physical reactions within the body. But with the high mental attainments these become rather as conditions to be met in judgment of the effect of all influences upon the attributes of the physical, mental and spiritual body as one. From Mercury there will be the high mental activity. And without bad associations, the entity will succeed in any undertaking in which there is the lending of itself to its fullest extent. In Mercury we find the great mental abilities will be manifested. In Mercury the high mental efficiencies and abilities, and the ability to tell a story well. Also the greater efforts or activities of the entity may be in using the mental self, rather than physical labors. From Mercury we find the high mental abilities. Through the astrological aspects in Mercury we find a high mental ability, analytical in every phase of its relationships. The why is the question ever in the entity's experience. And too easily, from those influences of Mercury, they may be reasoned away, the real answers to the questions from within, and the easier way chosen for the moment. From Mercury we find the high mental abilities, as may make for confusions as they have at times, with that activity in Saturn as well as Venus. And in the present these make some confusions in the entity's choice of mental expansion, as it were, as in relationships to things pertaining to social activities or relations, or as to the morality of this or that influence, or activity in the experience of those with whom the entity may be associated in one manner or another. We find from Mercury the mental abilities and the beautiful visions that have opened at times to the entity in the abilities when there appeared as if the affluence of the environ of self might arise, and bring into the associations that which was materially beautiful. All the beauty, all the love is of the Father. All the selfishness, all the hate, all the spite are of those things that make us aware of our facing the shadows rather than the light. Then right about face and keep thy face toward the sunlight of truth, as is shown in him, and the shadows will fall far behind. In Mercury, the high mental abilities. The interest in things pertaining to activities of individuals where there has been and is required mental application of self in relationships to things as well as conditions, in the experiences of others. From Mercury we find rather the inclination for the high mental abilities, also the rather stubborn nature, that is considered by others to be a part of the latent influence within the experience. Oft the entity becomes, or is considered by others as being, heady, or head-minded, or bull-headed, as some would say, to give it an expressive feeling or emotion. From Mercury we find the high ennobling influences, the high mentality, thinking things through. Thus the entity's ability to write, if it would apply self in the direction of what may be called the commonplace things in the experiences of others, especially stories for children,